The last two videos I've done a lot of research on, and I've done everything I can. The next one is probably the least researched uh, discussion. It doesn't mean I haven't done a bunch of research on it. It means that, in general, for anybody who has studied these subjects, this is the one that just gets the hardest amount of non studies done. So, I wanted to tell a story of Star Wars. More precisely, George Lucas, when he wanted to make a movie based on the old serials he used to watch as a kid. He would just go into a theater, and they'd have like the latest show episode of Flash Gordon, and they'd have these great little graphics and these little attack moments, and he would just create this thing in his mind, and he'd be like, oh, I want to do this. And he became a director, and he was a very, very visual director. Even his films that weren't Star Wars, before Star Wars, were very visual and very more about the sound of everything than about what people said. And that sounds weird, but if you've seen the movies, you'd be like, yeah, yeah, you've got it. And so he was told, okay, why don't you make a normal film? Why don't you make a film that everybody's going to like? And he thought of Flash Gordon and how everybody liked it, and he said, okay, I'm going to get a bit of money, and I'm going to do this. So he got about $12 million, and even then, that wasn't very much, especially for everything that he was going to do. So they kind of joked that it was the most expensive indie film ever made. And it was right. Every shot they made, they tried to use somehow. And he sent videos to all of his people, and he made visual scripts of what he wanted, and he showed videos of different things that he wanted. Like he showed videos of gunfights or dogfights in World War II, and he said, "I want that feel within the game. I want shots like this, like that in this game or in this movie." And when they fight, I want it to look like those those cool sword fight films from Camelot and King Arthur and the Three Musketeers. I want them to be like that, and I want the princess to be this ultimate princess, and I want all of this. And he went through a lot of rises and falls and difficulties, and he had to go through a process. And there was kind of a joke that he never looked happy, not even once during the entire production. It was just nothing but stress for him, even though everything worked the way he wanted it. But nothing really stopped him. He had to yell at people. There were times where he found out that he'd get back to the effects people, and they'd be like, well, we haven't actually made anything. We just, did our cool office stuff. And he's like, you have to do stuff. You have to make as much as you can, as fast as you can, because, my movie is coming out in a couple months. Get it done now, or you're all fired. And he had to actually assemble that team himself. And, just a giant ball of stress. And it became Star Wars. And just about every movie you can think of to this day is based off of Star Wars. All the major movies that have made all the money, they've used his same process. They have called him an absolute success. But if you were to ask him directly, right after the film came out, if this movie was going to be a success, the answer is he had no idea. In fact, he kind of hated the film. And that sounds really weird. But even after going to see the movie in the theater and having tons of applause and stuff, he didn't really believe it. Because in his mind, it wasn't perfect. It wasn't quite there, and he just had to fix it a little. And maybe it's this: he just didn't feel like he had the control he needed, and that's kind of where we're going. And the same way as going into the flow and things like that may help you become a cosplayer, and you throw in a lot of passion. The same thing happens for video games. You actually end up having the same amount of for the subject. Like George Lucas still loves those old school movies. That's why he made Indiana Jones. He based everything off of old school movies he liked as a kid. Same with Steel. That's why Spielberg jumped in. But he just didn't feel as connected. He didn't feel a lot of power over everything. He didn't feel as much acceptance over what he saw. So yes, he likes the subject the same, or as a one. If we were to look at it, he likes the subject the same, but he just doesn't have the same amount of passion or the same amount of energy within it. And he doesn't know how to deal with that. Well, this brings up a major question, and I'm going to jump over to here first. We have very few studies, very, very few studies on success. We do not know how people become successful. You will read thousands of books where people are like, well, successful people do this. And the reality is, no, they don't. We don't, there are tons of people who do that exact same thing and it doesn't work out. Somebody asked, George Lucas how he became famous, and he's just like, I don't know. I got lucky. And if you were to, and most of the studies done on people who have become successful is they were in the right place at the right time and they were willing to do the work. And, they were willing to do more than that. I'm not going to show the slide, but they were willing to bend laws. They were willing to be stupid. They were willing to, be kind of dangerous with what they were doing. Dangerous things happen. And look at George Lucas. He knew what he was doing was just this big ball of stress because he knew what he was doing was was an expensive thing, and he had to make this film, and he didn't know how to get the money back because at the time of George Lucas, everybody was running, the mob was running running Hollywood. He got his money from the mob to make Star Wars. And, there's other companies like that. And he's just like, I got to pay this money back. This is $12 million. I cannot, not make a profit. Otherwise, they will kill me. And so he was desperate. And that's the problem. Most studies we have on success, they're not very good. Same with intelligence or anything we do. We go, okay, what makes somebody autistic? And we test water and we test vaccines and we test everything we can to find out what's causing autism. But we don't ask questions like, what makes somebody intelligent? We say, well, it's going to college, but we've got a bunch of people with college degrees who are absolute idiots now. That's not it. Then we ask, well, are there more parameters that we can use? And the answer is nobody has ever tested for that. They do not do these studies. It is such a small amount that is it actually causes anger in me. As a kid, I actually had to deal with this a lot because I was quite gifted. And about half the teachers I dealt with didn't know how to recognize giftedness. So many of them thought I'm not average. So therefore, they were trained to recognize, autism and other stuff like that. And they just went, well, obviously you've got a mental disorder because you're smarter than me. And that sounds really awful, but that's what happened. I actually had to fight people to prove that I was smart. And oh man, that's an awful memory. But because we haven't done all of these studies, we don't know how success happens. And when we put it into our brain, we create this new character, this new thing where, just this person shows up and they're just perfect. Everything about them is perfect. They are just perfect. Look. Oh, they just have all the right, everything happens right perfectly for them, and they never go through any problems. And this becomes kind of a story arc, or a famous character called the Mary Sue, who showed up in fan fiction. And this is from a comic called Ensign Sue Must Die. And it honestly describes Mary Sue perfectly, so I recommend you look up Ensign Sue Must Die. But it's about, all the different tropes we have about Mary Sue. Oh, she's obviously, whatever they need, she can do. And she happens to be related to every single person that's super powerful. And she, has every guy who wants to fall in love with her. And, just a lot of stuff like that. And we do this because we don't know how success happens, so we make up this character that doesn't actually work that way. George Lucas went through stress to make Star Wars. Steven Spielberg went through stress to make his movies. E.T. came from him actually having to edit a movie for so long that he made up an imaginary friend, and it became E.T. That's where it came from. And, you read about this, but you don't realize that they go through all these stresses and they go through all these difficulties, and not everything they do works. But in our minds, no, everything they do is correct. Everything they do is well done, and they know what they're doing. And we just apply that to anybody that is successful. We just give them kind of a Mary Sue attitude, and it becomes a problem because we don't know how to do that study. And so we're stuck with this. Well, we know all the people with problems, and we've got tons of studies on that matter, but we don't really do studies on success because, frankly, we don't know how to admit that somebody's more successful than us, or that it may not be repeatable. We may not be able to do those same things. There's tons of people that are impoverished who are doing a lot of the same stuff as rich people, but we have very few billionaires, but several rich. That doesn't, but way more poor. That doesn't mean that the poor people or the rich people are good or bad. It just means something happened and we don't know how to talk about it. Well, that exact same subject is mass shooters. And the same process that created an entrepreneur, that created a George Lucas, created a mass shooter. And it's a weird process. By the way, the bottom left people were not mass shooters in the designation that I'm giving them. They were actually recruited. She actually recruited him. They were terrorists, and she recruited him for terrorism. So they're not mass shooters. They were terrorists. That is how their process happened. But the Columbine people and all the other people, they had a process. And the process was, they went through all these downfalls, but they had this idea in their head where they were like, okay, I want to do this. And yes, it is evil. But in their minds, they're like, okay, I want to do this. So I'm going to collect guns. And nobody really stops them. Nothing bad happens. And so they go, okay, well, I'm going to do this. I'm just going to continue this to see how long it goes until somebody stops me. And it's fascinating because the guy you're looking at, the guy with the orange hair, he specifically said, I asked people to stop me. I told people what I was up to, and they didn't stop me. So obviously it must happen because nobody stopped me. That there wasn't a stopping thing. And you'll find the same thing with entrepreneurs, with a lot of successful people, is they go, I didn't have a lot of stuff stopping me, so I became successful. And that doesn't mean that they're particularly smart or particularly good. They just happen to be, they had the idea come into their minds, and they didn't get rid of it. They recruited themselves. And this is an impossibly hard subject to talk to people about because, well, these are mass shooters. And everybody goes, well, it must be a mental difficulty they have. It has to be, that left side of the thing that we've been doing all these studies on. It can't be this completely other thing. And you have to explain, no, it is. Or it's this completely different subject. One day, they get this idea, and instead of talking themselves out of it, they just see if they can. And they just keep on going. And as insane as it sounds, they expect people to stop them. And because they don't get stopped, they think, well, I guess it's meant to be. And yeah, that's incredibly evil. And yet, we don't know how to talk about that subject. We don't know how to admit that, yes, the person next to you might be planning to shoot up the school. More likely, they're planning to make some extra money, start up this new idea they've been working on, and they're really kind of, scared of it. And, they're going to go through failures and they're going to go through successes like anybody else. It's just somehow mass shooters, they, oh man, sorry. The reason why I started the study on assholes was I was in a TV studio when Columbine happened, and I had to be the guy who, you know, did all the credits and stuff. And if you ever hear somebody go, "Oh, you know, the TV people know what's going on," no, we don't. Like, all I heard was Ittleton, and we didn't know where Ittleton was. And I had just moved from a town that sounds Ittleton. It was called Middleton. And we didn't know who was doing it. We didn't know where it was. And it honestly took me a good 30 minutes to realize that it wasn't my home. And ever since then, I have studied this like crazy. And as best as I can tell, we've been looking at it. We've been trying to study it in such a way to say, well, it must be because they have a mental disease, or it must be because of all the studies that we've done that we want to study on. We've never been able to study successes, so we've never been able to understand mass shooters because, frankly, they were successful at what they did. And that is a scary subject. Their mindset was the same as any entrepreneur who's successful today. Only instead of, trying to make money, they decided to create death. And in case you're wondering, almost every single person who has done this, and we've been able to catch them and interview them, has said that it wasn't the way they wanted it to. They felt such a disconnect from it. They said it wasn't how they wanted it to be. And in the same way, George Lucas didn't feel like Star Wars was good enough. Many of them felt that these shootings weren't good enough. And that was one of the last words said by the Columbine shooters was, "Man, this isn't as fun as I thought it would be." And then they blew their brains out. That's the reality that we have to deal with. And it's the reason why it's taken me forever to write the friggin' book on the matter is I nearly cry every time I have to talk about the subject. But within video games, we have the same thing. We have a lot of the same thing. We talk about successes in video games, and we don't really know how they did it, and we make up this Mary Sue about them. And in the same way, why is Mario successful? Well, the truth is, he isn't. You've died thousands of times. You just haven't realized that, this is a new Mario. As weird as it sounds. He's just successful because of all the losses have taught you how to succeed. And that's what the mass shooters were using, was all the losses taught them how to succeed. And I just realized that. Wow, thanks. So, within the equation, it became a reflex for them to just work on this subject and to work on it. And every great video game designer does the same thing. At one point, one of the creators of Doom was asked, and this was before he was part of id Software, he snuck into his middle school to use the computer, and he was asked, well, what if we hadn't have caught you? Would you have continued? And he said, yeah, would have totally continued. These are computers. I love them. And he's become a great success because of it. But we don't know how to do those kinds of studies because it means we have to find out the humanity of success. We have to destroy the Mary Sue, and we have to accept that we may not be able to do it ourselves. And that's a scary subject. And far worse, that this same process might be used for evil. And if we want rights and privileges and all these wonderful things, we have to allow for evil to be done. And that's just a scary subject. So, this has been a lot of videos that are scary, are frightening, are terrifying. And I fully admit, I don't know where this study is going on the matter. Next week, we're going to talk about the religiosity of cosplay, of conventions, and why they do those things. And we're going to use the a lot of the same subjects you've seen from this from this week will be used for next week, and it won't be used. And at no point will I have to mention a mass shooter or a terrorist or anything like that. So I am really looking forward to it. So there we go. Catch y'all later, and I need to go cry.